Good afternoon. This time of the day, when I sit down and listen to people, I usually fall asleep. But given the topics is about standards, sounds very exciting, doesn't it? But actually it is, because standards is a fantastic way of gathering, collecting existing knowledge, assessing it, and packaging it in a way that makes it available to more people. So standardization is a slow, sometimes tedious process, but it is a great tool for knowledge management. So I really believe this is good. And I'm going to give you one example of a standard that's been used in order to allow us to save energy in buildings, in historic buildings, in a reasonable way. Next, please. Okay, so the picture is from my hometown, and in a nutshell, it summarizes the challenges of improving energy performance of not only the single historic buildings, but also of the historic building stock. The name of the standard is Guidelines for Improving the Energy Performance of Historic Buildings, EN16883, 2017. So this is available from your standardization, national standardization bodies, and responsible for the task group that wrote the standard is the CEN, the European Standardization Committee. Next, please. Lucky Luke is one of my favorite characters from the literature, and those of you who know him knows that he moves faster than his own shadow. So I'm going to go to the summary and tell you what I think is important for this presentation. First thing, there is a European standard on improving energy performance in historic buildings. How many of you knew this before the presentation? All right, that's better than usual. And there's some people here in the front too who know it. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, not a lot of people know about it, and therefore it's not being used. But we're looking for organizations, individuals, professionals who would like to apply the standard, and we want to find out how the standard works in practice. So these are my conclusions. Next, please.
You want to try whether it works?
Oh yeah, I forgot. A lot of things to consider here. Again, this is a picture from my hometown. This is where I live. We need to balance things. On the one hand, we want to reduce the energy demand for economic reasons, for reasons of global environment, but we also want to make sure that we, in a reasonable way, preserve the cultural heritage for future generations. So, on the left, this is a Photoshop thing. We put solar cells on the roof. In this case, that would not happen. I think in other countries, that might be something you could argue, whether, you could discuss whether it's a good idea or not. On the right is something that happened on the west coast of Sweden, in Gothenburg, after the energy crisis that we had in the mid-70s. We had a rather nice building from the beginning, and then it was energy refurbished and totally destroyed. And I'm sure that in your countries you will find similar buildings. So I'm showing these pictures because the aim of the standard is to find, for each case, for each context, a reasonable balance between between building conservation and between energy conservation. But if we're too careful, if we don't consider the potential for saving energy in the existing building stock, and that's a large part of the building sector, then somebody else is paying the price. This is a picture from floodings in Bangladesh. Some general information about the standard. Alexander mentioned some things already. It's a guideline, so it's not a standard that tells you exactly that you must do things in a certain way. The scope. We had a lot of discussions about the scope and what defines a historic building. We agree that we're talking about historically, architecturally, and culturally valuable buildings. And to keep in mind, it's not limited to listed buildings, that is, buildings that have some kind of form of protection, but rather it's about a wide range of historic buildings of different types, different ages. And this was also mentioned earlier on, it's a procedural standard. So it describes a procedure that helps us to define an appropriate solution for a particular building. This is an overview of the standard or of the procedure. I will come back to the details of it. So the idea is that for each individual building, we will consider what are the conditions and what would be suitable solutions for that building. It's a step-by-step process with some iterations where we may or may not go back. And in this standard, the text, each part of the flowchart is described in detail. So the first part is initiating the planning process. And this is just a number of things to consider, so I'm not going to go into detail about that. The second part is building survey and assessment, describing the condition of the building as it is today. Third part is specifying objectives. Usually when it comes to energy refurbishment, we have objectives when it comes to energy savings, to economics. Sometimes we have explicit objectives for the preservation issues, but in most cases, that's my experience, that's implicit. So by now, we've defined where we are and where we would like to go. And comparing the status of the building today with the objectives we've set out, we should decide, do we need to make any changes? And after that, or if we want to make changes, then the next steps will help us to define appropriate solutions. The next part, we start with a long list of measures. And that list must be defined, I think, in each country, depending on geographics, climate, and also traditions. Based on that long list, a multidisciplinary group will make sort of a brief assessment and sort out measures that obviously would not work, point at the measures that the group thinks are suitable or useful, and then spend a fair amount of time with the measures that are in between, where we could go either way. In the end, we will have a short list of measures, and then we'll make a careful assessment of the measures based on energy performance, economics, life cycle analysis, etc. So for a limited number of measures, we'll make an in-depth assessment. The next step is to define packages. We have a number of individual solutions, but we need to consider how they work together and what would be a suitable package of measures. And finally, we look at the performance of a proposed package, compare that to the objectives, and see if we're happy with that, then we're fine. If we don't meet the objectives, then we have to go back and make changes. So, when I talk about the standard, there are two kinds of reactions. People say, well, what about it? This is the way we've always been working. And in that case, we're fine. Other people say this is way too complicated. And it might be too complicated if you're talking about only replacing a part of a building. But if it's a big investment for a building, then it's certainly worth the time. I think that the standard can be used in two ways. The first is for quality assurance. The heritage authorities in my country could demand that if you're working with a listed building, for example, then you should follow this procedure. Another way to use it is for inspiration, for to modify existing procedures. Most professionals working with energy refurbishment of historic buildings, of course, don't do it randomly. There is a process that's implicit or explicit, and this could feed into existing procedures, possibly refining them, even improving them. And you could also use it as a simple checklist, things to keep in mind. I've already talked about some questions. Is the standard being used? No, not much. And one reason is that professionals don't know about it yet. Another reason might be that professionals for some reason choose not, that they're aware of it. Some people are aware of it, but they choose not to use it. This is something we don't know about, but we're trying to find out. So within this task 59 that we've had an introduction of this morning, we're trying to assess the standard. How does it work in practice? So we're using case studies. We've identified a limited number of buildings where the standard has been used. So we follow the planning process and the implementation process closely. And we conduct interviews with a number of people who are using the standard in different ways. But we still need more case studies. So if anybody is using the standard, or, well, there's only one person who knew about the standard, so in this group, the odds would be poor. But if anybody is considering to use the standard, we would like to find out how it works in practice. Somebody said that a camel is a horse designed by committee. It's functional, but not so elegant. The same thing could be said for the standard, that it's a sort of a compromise. We had people working, some 40-50 people working from 18 different countries. So the information is not very detailed. So for instance, as an example, it's clearly stated that you need a life cycle perspective when you make assessment of economic and environmental performance, but it's not said how to do it. So within the Task 59 work group, we're trying to see, is it possible that we can do something to enhance the standard, make it more accessible to the professionals, for instance, by providing tools for life cycle analysis. So we're compiling a list of tools, other types of guidelines, more specific ones, and also training modules that could be useful here. Within Task 59, as Alexandra said this morning, we're compiling best practice for real buildings and also best practice solutions. And this would be something that can be used both for inspiration, but also to find solutions that would work for a particular building in a particular context. So coming back to my summary, by now I think we achieved one objective, that you are aware of that there is a standard. I hope you will have a look at it if you are working in this field. If you choose to use it, we would appreciate any kind of feedback. Or if you have comments or ideas, please let us know. So you have the web page and my email address. Thank you.